Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko from Niles, Ohio.
And today we're going to be talking with Jeremy Brecher, who is a writer, historian, and activist, and author of numerous books on labor and social movements, as well as doing a lot of work in the climate movement. Jeremy is the author of Strike, which is a great book, historical book, an important book that Bob and I are big fans of, and also a more recent book, Against Doom, a Climate Insurgency Manual. He's also the senior advisor for the Labor Network for Sustainability, and so we're going to be talking about there's a bit of a long history around labor and the environment. We've seen industry try to pit the two against each other, and then we've seen we've seen progress in that relationship in recent years. And so we're going to be talking about all of that today with Jeremy, who's been engaged at the intersection of labor, the environment, climate for quite some time. Jeremy, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Maybe to kick off, just because I think we just had the 52nd anniversary of Strike coming out. We can talk a little bit about that. Maybe if you wanted to just start off with a bit about the power of the strike and what the source of that power is. It's a kind of basic question, but can often be overlooked.
A basic theme of strike and a great deal of the rest of what I've written over the years is based on the fact that, as the old industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies song said, they've taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. And I think that the underlying power of the strike, and it's actually not just of strikes, but of all ways in which people withdraw their cooperation and withdraw their support from whatever the power centers or the people or the oppressive forces that they're facing and are confronting. The fact that the powers of this earth ultimately are dependent on the cooperation or at least acquiescence of ordinary folks is a fundamental principle and almost always ignored. When people are thinking about power, they think about the power of bosses, employers, big corporations, the government, armies. But as that song says, without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. And that fundamental idea of the withdrawal of labor power in the case of a strike, or even more broadly, the withdrawal of cooperation with the powers and principalities of the earth, is the fundamental source of power that all of us who often feel and seem to be powerless have if we can cooperate in withdrawing our cooperation from those who are oppressing us or who are doing things that are harmful to us.
You've put out a new edition. What would you say that the major kind of trends or differences are from that first phase you studied up to 1970, say, and then since then? It seems like the labor movement has been, although the last few years we've certainly seen an upsurge, but for the last 40 or 50 years, it's been on the defensive, it's been attacked. The Democratic Party, who were supposed to be its allies, really haven't done, what they could have done to support it. What do you think the biggest shift has been, like, from 1970 on, and then do you think the last few years are indicative of another kind of trend toward more union organizing, more maybe aggressive or militant union work?
The decline of labor organization and visible struggle over the last at least 40 years. I think you're right in saying the 70s, early 70s is really when it begins to turn, is a very real phenomenon and not one to be ignored. I don't think any kind of happy talk saying, oh, labor's fine and this is all an exaggeration. I don't think it's really true. I think there was a major decline in the power of organized labor and of working people in general. I think that a primary cause of it was globalization, because that meant that Ford or General Motors or US Steel could take a large part of their production and their other operations and move it anywhere around the world that was cheapest. And that was a gun pointed at the head of workers and organized labor. And it essentially created a bargaining situation where they had to accept worse and worse conditions, give up more and more power under the threat that the jobs would simply be closed. Their employers would shut down, move away. And so there were other causes too. Certainly public policy played a role, but the loss of the ability, the bargaining power that came from being able to shut down a plant because the bosses could thumb their noses at the unions and say, sure, go ahead, shut down the plant. We can shut down the plant. We're going to shut it down and move it to Timbuktu, was a central change in the power relations. And so the unions found some techniques and tactics for fighting back against that, but the overall shift in the balance of power was very profound. The new one, the last part of your question is about today, last couple of years, but was there a middle part in your question?
No, that's fine. And actually, we can do that other part because I think what you got at. Let me just say to follow, because I noticed that the great Stoughton Lindblad, your book in Stoughton, was a friend of mine. He lived in the town where I am now.
I know. I was going to ask you. You said you were from Niles. Stoughton was. I was going to ask you.
I used to visit him. It's a great loss, but he often talked about, in a very critical way, that unions, especially from the New Deal era on, gave up the right to strike. That was part of the agreement, that kind of more corporatist agreement. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that were, the fact that labor has ceded a lot of its more effective, maybe most effective of strategies, and whether you see that coming back. We're hearing at least things from like Sean Fain and the Amazon and Starbucks workers that sound a lot like that labor militancy. But without that strike, whether it's legal or not, can labor really continue this path toward making improvements?
The auto industry and auto workers are a great example to explore the questions that you're raising. And the great industrial union organizing campaigns of the 30s and 40s brought large hundreds of thousands of workers, actually millions, into unions that were basically, in most cases, new unions. And the workers who were coming into them were people who had not grown up with unions, had experiences with unions. If they had, they were often bad experiences. And nonetheless, conditions got more and more unbearable as far as the pace of work, the level of pay, forced overtime, etc. I'm mentioning these things because they're all very similar to the things that workers are facing today, in spite of the great difference in our society and the way work is organized. But these fundamental problems have intensified during the period of loss of power of organized labor. These problems have gotten more and more intense. And that's the background to, I'm getting instability in your visuals. Is that okay? Okay.
I was writing. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. I just want to make sure there wasn't any problem. So the workers today are facing many of those same fundamental problems. And I think that's an important reason that you are seeing in the last couple of years forms of worker self-organization and action that you have not seen for decades. The scale of it is very hard to evaluate in terms of, are we just at the beginning of a great trajectory of more extensive and intensive labor action, or are we seeing just a bigger blip in the long-term decline? I think it's too early to make a definitive opinion about that. And as Yogi Berra used to say, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. But there's certainly things that are happening in 2023 that were very different from things that had been happening in the recent decades.
I find it. I was listening to a different podcast, another podcast, not our podcast, the other day, and it was talking about how it was the topic was around swing as youth voters as the new swing vote, and it was actually saying that 88% of under 30s are pro labor union, which is mind-boggling. And that includes any Trump voters, Republicans, along those lines. And I'm wondering how you think that trend is contributing to this. As we see a lot of youth, Gen Z, millennials, which are becoming more and more progressive on labor issues, more than previous generations.
The change in overall support for unions among the American public has been very dramatic. And in the poll data, the amount of support for unions, the people who say unions are a good thing or they're in favor of unions, has grown enormously over the last few years, most extreme among young people. As you say, one recent poll found that 88% of young people said they would support or did support unions. And it's, by the way, in my organization, the Labor Network for Sustainability has a young worker project, which is reaching out to young workers around the combination of labor and climate issues, because young people are also very concerned about climate and much more both worried about it and more willing to take action around it than their elders. That has allowed me to read a bunch of interviews with younger people and young workers and get some sense of their concerns. And they both feel squeezed by the kinds of work pressures I was referring to before: speed up, low pay, and very much by insecurity and the fact that when they look forward in their lives, even if they went to college, have some kind of skill, they still, as they look forward, see a very dim, not to say grim future. And I think that makes them very interested both in trying to participate in climate protection and in organizing unions, taking part in unions. Unions are not always hospitable to young people. This is a very old problem in the labor movement, where often each new generation of workers finds that the established trade union leadership, they're glad to get their dues, but they're not really that interested in having them join in playing a leading role in the organization. That's a long-standing kind of struggle that happens generation after generation. We've obviously been seeing that here in the unions, where you're not getting an upsurge and where you're not getting new leadership coming up. But and that's one of the reasons that the Starbucks workers and the Amazon workers have formed their own unions, as you say, overwhelmingly composed of young people, because they looked at the existing unions and they said, is there really a place for us here? If the existing unions had said, here's your home, we're going to make this a place that you can be who you are and fight for the things that you care about, I think that they would have had a lot of interest in joining them and operating under their umbrella. But what actually happened is that the young people who were forming local sort of resistance groups in their workplaces looked at what the proposition was and say, you know what, we think we better just do this on our own. So I think that's a piece of the generational dynamic here too, where, as in the case of the recent UAW events, the kind of the door has been opened to younger people to play a leading role, then I think that they've very much stepped forward and found a way to operate within the existing trade union structure, or at least within a changed, the very much developing version of the trade union structure. And that's right in the UAW, where the new leadership that was elected in 20 is very different in its whole approach, much, much more open, totally unlike previous UAW and most other union negotiations, where the negotiations are hush, and it's considered completely illegitimate to tell the membership what's going on in the negotiations. They had weekly social media events where they briefed everyone on what was going on, and generally a kind of openness like that makes for a very different kind of organization and organizational culture. Yeah.
Would you attribute some of that? We've seen Sinn Féin and UAW leadership, and I would say some other unions too, be more outspoken on issues that aren't necessarily labor issues. There's one where we see them vocally critical of the billionaire class, but Sinn Féin came out and called for a ceasefire in Gaza. We see labor much more vocal on climate issues, for example, than they have been in the past. Would you attribute that to some of this younger membership or other factors at play?
Yeah, it is a significant factor. And the reality is that if established union leadership wants young people to believe that they're people, something to support and work with, they have to address climate, and they're finding that out. And the ones who are finding it out are beginning to do it. There's also a more fundamental point here, which is you can look at a trade union as something that's designed to represent, almost like representing the business interests of a group of small businesses in a trade or trade federation. Their job is to represent the business interests of their members, and it's often called business unionism, that mentality and that kind of institutional approach. There's a very different pole within the labor movement, which is often called social unionism or social movement unionism or other terms like that, that see union members as working people who happen to be working in one particular workplace or one particular industry, but who share interests with other working people around the country, even around the world. And those interests go to common things that are common for those people to face. So in the case of climate, unions have been very reluctant to become involved with climate issues because there are unions who say our members will lose jobs if climate protection measures are taken, if we start reducing fossil fuel use, for example. Our workers in the fossil fuel industries will lose jobs, and that's been a very powerful force and concern within organized labor. Also a legitimate one, but one that needs to be addressed by saying, yeah, they should not bear the burden of the necessary changes that are necessary to protect all working people and all people. If it comes to that, we have to have a just transition that protects them and makes sure that they're made whole in the transition. So there are, in my view, there is not a contradiction between unions representing the interests of their workers, of their members, as people who work in a particular place in a particular industry, and at the same time representing their interests as part of the working class, working people as a whole. And you can certainly see that in the Sinn Féin and the new UAW leadership, which has been very explicit in terms of, we're not here to represent just the interests of people in one factory or company, or even just of our members. We consider, for example, unorganized workers in other plants to be part of our constituency. We have an obligation to represent them and their interests, and we have an obligation to create conditions of welcome that will encourage them to join with us, both for their own struggles and for the broader struggles of auto workers and working people in general. So you're definitely seeing that development there and in a number of other unions. I would not say that it's a dominant trend, and I would keep an eye open for no union leaders are going to counterattack against Sean Fain this week. But as things go forward, I would keep an eye open for counter pressures where people say there's a lot of hype here, but really, and then they'll find some small thing to pick away at. I don't think the UAW and Sean Fain are terribly vulnerable to that at this point, but I think you'll find the response in terms of following the course that they've laid out will be uneven. Some unions will do it, some won't.
Just was it yesterday, Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters met with Trump. And you've noticed in the past couple of years, Republicans like Hawley and Cotton, who are utterly disingenuous, will put out these statements of support for unions and labor. And I think a lot of the reason they can do that is because the Democratic Party has left the field clear to a large degree. Obama hasn't really done anything. Biden calls himself the most pro-union president and forced the railroad workers back to work. How difficult is it to create a more vibrant and aggressive union movement without any that kind of support? I mean, the ruling class, Wall Street, they got plenty of support all over the political spectrum, and labor not so much. How do you do it without having that kind of really sturdy support? You go back to FDR and the New Deal or something like that.
It's interesting that FDR, although he's remembered as a great supporter of labor, was actually a very ambiguous figure in that regard. He said, curse strike situation.
He took what, $6 million for the 1936 election, and then after that, he was, But no, my point is that's all.
But the CIL rolled on anyway. That's in there, and so when there's that kind of head of steam behind worker organization, when workers are in a mindset where they say, we're just going to do this because we believe in it, we know it's necessary, it's crucial to our future, then the power of the strike that we talked about before, and more broadly, the power of workers in society comes into play. And it's definitely true that having political support is extremely helpful. But the reality is, you point out, the power of capital is, under most normal circumstances, entrenched in government and public policy in ways that labor can only make minor inroads into. And I take that as a kind of given condition until millions of people are ready to sit down in their plants, walk out of their offices, go out in the streets, until there's that kind of mass popular power, which then public officials have to say, does this mean I won't get reelected? Or does this mean that my agency or government is going to get delegitimated in terms of the people? Only when you begin getting that kind of pressure at work do you get a real significant willingness of politicians and parties to stand up to the Wall Streets and actually represent interests of workers. And when that people don't have that kind of mass pressure and mobilization, things tend to slide back to, at least partway back to, conventional domination of politics by them that have. So that, I think I'm not against experiments with labor parties or various kinds of explorations like that, but I think the Democratic Party has to be seen more as a pawn of powerful forces than as a powerful force in its own right. And so capturing the Democratic Party or influencing it as a whole is pretty limited as a strategy. That doesn't, but at the same time, I don't think a third party strategy per se is especially in the American context, too promising. What you need to have is working people organized in their own interest, and all of us organized in our own interest in the sense that climate protection, peace, these are interests of everybody. And we need to be organized in fighting for those interests and then use that collective power as a way to pressure the politicians to do the right thing. That doesn't mean that running somebody for office is always a bad idea. Often it's a good idea. Looking at the squad, you can see sometimes it's a brilliant idea. But as an overall strategy, I think the core power that working people have available is through their own self-organization and action.
And I think we're seeing that with the Amazon and Starbucks workers. I know I'm in Texas and I'm in a Texas State Employees Union, which is affiliated with the CWA. And they're always hitting me up saying, will you add an extra $5 a month or something to cope? Which I won't do because I'm not giving money to the Texas Democratic Party. It's talking about throwing it away. And there's this heavy reliance, and I've seen this and I've talked to other people in other states on the Democratic Party for historical reasons. But I think that as long as they continue to rely on that, remember Obama had promised, what was it, the check-off system or something like that. And then we've seen these horrible court cases like the AFSCME Janus case. I don't know. I guess part of me would like to say, let's just say screw you to the Democratic Party and go out and do this in an autonomous way. I don't know if that's possible or not, but I think it's clearly a problem when not just labor isn't really willing to do what it promises it'll do to get votes, but when the unions themselves are like so connected and glued in many ways to the Democratic Party. They're always hitting me up, give money to the Texas Democrats, do this, do that. And it's not, I don't really see it going anywhere. Obviously in Texas, it's not really accomplishing anything. That's just a rant, really. It's something I talk about and think about a lot. But as I look at, because remember last year, everybody was saying like, why can't American workers be like the French workers who are out in the streets and they're raising hell and all kinds of stuff like that. And it's just like with exceptions, and them way better than I do, that's never really been the way American labor was structured. And you had that period of class war, right? From the end of the Civil War until, I guess, the little steel strikes. But overall, it's been a more, I don't know, timid movement. I mean, there are long historical reasons here that I rack my brain thinking about all the time. Yeah.
I was going to shift to some questions around labor and climate a little bit more. My first question in this segue, Jeremy, is how has the politics of workers and climate changed in recent years, which is, something that you've been working on with your work with LNS and a lot over the last few years, quite some time now.
Yeah. So my first answer is it hasn't changed enough, but it has changed. I think the biggest change of all is something that we've just seen, which was the UAW in the context of the new leadership and Big Three, strike against the Big Three, took on the idea of just transition to a climate safe economy as a central part, not only of its advocacy for what the government should do, but it demands for what the industry should do. And at the core of the UAW strike against the Big Three was the issue of electrification of the auto industry. Were we going to go over to electric cars? And if we did, was that going to be used as a way to augment what someone times called the race to the bottom? Each manufacturer of cars and of batteries would find a way where the wages were lowest and where the labor law was weakest, where the right to organize was weakest, and they make their plants there and they produce their cars and their batteries there, and they would use the whole electrification of the industry as a means to drive down conditions for workers and basically render unions powerless. And that was actually going on. We are well into that process. The major car companies have primarily built their plants in the South, in states that have right to work laws, and the new battery plants are being done as joint ventures with foreign corporations, which claim that they can't be claim that they can't have the same contracts as American workers and American unions, and all that was used as a smokescreen to drive down conditions for the workers in those plants, and then use that as leverage to demand that the workers in the Midwest and elsewhere outside of the South had to meet those lower wage, more dangerous conditions.
Mhm.
And the UAW took that head on and said, we are completely unwilling to accept this. And instead, you have to raise the conditions of the plants that are making the electric vehicles and making the batteries to those of the rest of the industry and the union conditions that exist in our best plants. And they made that a central demand of the strike. And partially for that reason, more than 100 environmental organizations, including all the major ones, backed the strike, which is especially important, especially impressive because the propaganda of the companies was, oh, you're going to make the costs of the electric vehicles be prohibitive and no one's going to buy them, and you're going to defeat the effort to protect the climate by switching to electric vehicles. And they took that head on and said, no, if you make a process of transition to climate safe production be something that is actually a vehicle for severe harm to workers, you are going to undermine the drive for climate protection, and you are going to make enemies of the people who should be your friends. And instead of that, we need to raise the floor for everyone, especially for those who are being exploited in the production of electric vehicles and batteries, and instead raise the standards for them. And this was part of why the environmental movement overwhelmingly supported the UAW strike. And of course, the minute the strike was over, they said, okay, Tesla, you're next. You're coming right in our sights. And again, the propaganda is that, oh, if you organize Tesla and start paying the workers more than a pittance, you're going to make electric vehicles too expensive and no one will buy them and we'll be stuck with climate change. That is a bunch of hogwash, of course. And the alliance of the environmental groups and the UAW has been the perfect way to show that it's hogwash and to show the common interest that both organized groups have. And of course, we all have to make a living and we all have to live in this rapidly deteriorating climate. In fact, we're all both workers and we're all both victims of climate change. And we're fighting for our own interests in both of those fronts. And what this UAW strike did was to bring them together and around the idea of a just transition that would make sure that workers benefited in the transition to a climate safe economy rather than being desperately harmed by it. That to me is the biggest step forward we've taken in my maybe 15 years of working in this area. Yeah.
And what we've seen in the not too distant past is that for example, through the 2010s and in the 2020s, I guess, we've seen a lot of pipeline battles. We saw campaigns against Keystone XL and Line 3 and Dakota Access Pipeline, and labor was always reluctant because the building trades were saying that you're going to cost our workers jobs because they're the ones building these pipelines. I've seen that history play out in front of my own eyes, right, as a climate organizer for the last 20 years. And I'm just wondering, are we seeing the sort of influence of the building trades begin to wane at this point, as we saw with what you just pointed out about the UAW strike?
It's going to be a struggle. I view this as the sort of the first big push. Of course, some of us have been pushing for a decade or more. People in a lot of unions have. But as you say, the opposition of what we call the fossil fuel unions, which is largely the building trades, miners, some of the utility workers, have dominated the approach of organized labor, specifically of the AFL-CIO. There have been pushbacks, there have been exceptions, there have been some beachheads made before. I think as the overall concern about climate change gets greater and greater as we face catastrophe after catastrophe, eventually the organized labor is going to have to change. And we're seeing pieces of that happening in many unions on a partial scale. The big stumbling block that we find is everyone's in favor of green jobs. Everyone's in favor of spending money, creating windmills and solar collectors and other forms of green energy, but the stumbling block is we have to do that. And we also have to stop putting the crap into the air. We have to we don't have to do it instantly, but we have to have managed decline of fossil fuel burning. And if we don't do that, then the sign of global warming that we already are experiencing with devastating effect, which is just love tap compared to what's in the pipeline for the future. And if we don't stop putting this stuff into the atmosphere, that is no amount of green jobs and installation and windmills is going to solve the problem. You have to cut the use and burning of fossil fuels and extraction of fossil fuels and replace it with renewable energy. You can't just add them together. And that's the stumbling block. Very few unions have been willing to say, yeah, you know what, we have to make sure that workers aren't the ones that get hurt by it, but we have to cut fossil fuel burning and fossil fuel extraction. And that's, I think, will be the place where the real battle comes, because some unions have got to step forward and say that's necessary. Now, the other piece here is realistically, from the point of view of the building trades, the number of jobs that are open to the building trades by green energy and other forms of climate protection are colossal compared to the tiny number of jobs that are actually being defended in fossil fuels. And they're less and less. The number of workers in renewable energy is now growing multiple times faster than the number in fossil fuel energy. So it's really a question of holding on to the past in a way that's bound to be a failure over even the medium run. But for all kinds of institutional reasons, it's very hard for them to make the leap to something else. The number of jobs for electricians that's being opened up is huge, completely disproportionate to the number of electricians who are working in fossil fuel power plants, and yet it's great division between different sectors of electrical workers union about their approach to climate protection and fossil fuels. And that's just one example of how the retrograde side here gets perpetuated. I think because of the realities of the climate crisis, it's like a foreign army is invading the country, and the people who are saying, oh, don't worry about that, they're just becoming more and more marginalized and more. Even a substantial number of Republicans say, oh yeah, if climate change is real, then they'll blame it on God knows what, all kinds of absurd things that have nothing to do with its real causes. But it's
like God being upset at us or things like that.
Yeah, which the evidence for that accumulates more and more every week. I think that is going to, it's the stability or that there's been of those kinds of positions within labor are going to be severely undermined. It's a question of when and what comes next.
Why is the leadership of the building trade still so attached to these fossil fuel jobs if there's this burgeoning field where their members could get jobs in green jobs and renewable energy and things like that?
I'm going to start with the thing that'll get me into the most trouble, which is they receive significant funding directly from the American Petroleum Institute.
There you
Their
go.
annual, their big gala events are funded by the American Petroleum Institute, which is the trade organization of the oil industry. I don't believe that's the principal cause, but it shows you how deeply in that the fossil fuel interests they are. In some cases, it is just a kind of macho belief in we're the big guys. We're the men who go out and do this tough work, and we get paid 3 or 4 times as much as the average worker. And by God, we earn it, and we're going to fight to keep it. It's a mentality like that's a part of it. And I'm sure there are other factors as well. As a matter of fact, I wish somebody would go and do a serious study of this question, because I haven't seen in all the time I've been working on it, somebody really go into that and find out. Some of it has to do with internal political balances. One union that I know about, the industrial IAM, the machinists union, has strong support for climate, passed a strong climate resolution, but it has a minority sector of railroad workers who are primarily people who haul coal. And they are, for very understandable reasons, very worried that if we shut down all the coal mines, their jobs are going to go. They happen to be a political power way disproportionate to their numbers within the union in terms of their representation on the executive board and stuff like that. So the overall policy of the union, which would have a lot to gain from climate protecting policies in other areas, but the power balance internally puts them in a position to call the shots, at least until a new leadership makes a different configuration of powers. Those are some of the things. I don't think there's any one simple explanation, but change is hard, and in organized labor, there's always been a lot of resistance to change at the top. That's why the CIO had split off from the AFL and had to start a new organization in order to organize the unorganized industrial workers. So hopefully we can do it without that kind of process, but it will be a struggle and a conflict, and in fact it already is.
Do you think labor's, or do you see it getting involved? Do you think it will get involved in other issues? I know I'm thinking of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Labor was deeply involved in that. And there are still issues like that. There's reproductive rights, and I'm not sure, but a significant percentage of union members now are female, they're women.
Yeah.
So do you think that there will be kind of an expansion into these other areas and as organizing tools as well?
I think it's ongoing. I mean, we see it with climate. The big recent example was immigrant rights, where organized labor was supported in the employer responsibility for turning in immigrants. And there was a campaign, but some unions in some areas began taking a very different approach and began supporting immigrant rights marches and protective legislation. And then some top union leaders went around to others and said, you know what? Our members, these are our members. These people you're saying that the employers should get them, be prosecuted if they don't fire them. These are our members. You got to quit it. We have to completely change our approach to it. And they did. And they became actually a bulwark of immigrant rights, and even today remain. They really have not been backsliding in that area that much, because it is their members, and it's also the people that they have to organize. That would be an example. And an example where there was a lot of Trump or Trumpism that they had to go up against for that. On reproductive rights for women, most unions have good positions on paper, but they have been gun shy about getting involved in this current round of the abortion rights struggle. That also could shift, partially because it's such an important political issue for the candidates. It's the best card of the candidates that they would want to support and that they hope will support them. And that, plus the crucial point that you make out, that women are no longer a tiny part of the labor movement, they're a very large part. Those things put together at least create a potential for making unions be more active and outspoken on reproductive rights. And other areas, it's bound to come, but it's also, again, likely to be it's bound to happen, but it's likely to be very uneven. There will be unions that take, and there are already unions that take extremely strong stances on a wide range of social issues. There was a opposition to the Iraq war that developed in organized labor that was completely out of line with its traditional support for Vietnam and the whole string of wars that it supported. The fact that Sinn Féin came out calling for a ceasefire in the halt to the Israeli bombing in Gaza it comes in the context of a very long and deep involvement of American labor with Israel. So the fact that there's that much of the beginning of a break, it doesn't indicate that it's all going to go that way. But when you start seeing little areas where if you have a solid rock and then you start seeing little pieces of it beginning to flake off, it's a hint that there's something going on. Again, I think it depends in part on how deep, broader disaffection with American and Israeli policy goes. It's certainly very much deeper than it has been in the past, and that's bound to have some effect. I think another factor there is that many people of color identify the Palestinians as people of color who are being abused by essentially white colonialists. As a Jew, it pains me to have to say that there's a lot of truth in this argument. And that means that in the unions that have strong African-American or other people of color presence, they are very far from the lockstep support for Israel that has been traditional for American labor. Where that leads, if you could tell me the outcome of the Gaza war, I'll tell you the outcome of that struggle.
Just earlier today, I got an email from Mike Elk, who runs Payday Report, who said he's actually he's had a few people cancel their donations because he's been reporting on Gaza. And I know this is a particularly difficult topic in the United States. We saw stuff like this during obviously the Vietnam era. I remember the 80s in Central America where there were, labor councils organized to oppose U.S. intervention in that. So that's actually did my MA on labor in the early Cold War. So this is something that's always fascinated me. I think labor's role in foreign policy from the old AFL-CIA days and things like that to the present is really important. And when Fain talks about, I heard him talking about Gaza and Palestine, he also made the point that the United States is spending billions, hundreds of billions of dollars abroad, and that's not being spent here on the kind of things workers need. I live near East Palestine, Ohio. It's still a dump. It's still toxic. And that's been over 6 months now, way over 6 months now. I think that's something that I always look to, and I know how difficult it is because you're disloyal, you're not a good American, you hate America, all this kind of stuff if you criticize foreign policy. But it seems Fain's obviously not a dumb guy, and I don't think he would do that if he thought it was reckless. I think he understands there's a crowd out there. There are people with their ears open to that.
I think we've been on for a while, so I think we're getting near the end of our time. I have maybe like one question left. I don't know if Bob has
I'm good.
any other questions. My last question is, we've talked a little bit about just transition. It's a term that goes back to at least Tony Mazzocchi in the 1970s about how to transition from industrial jobs, which are destructive and harmful for the environment, to something more renewable and protective, and it's been applied to climate. How would you say that just transition is being viewed now amongst the within the labor movement, particularly with the leadership?
There's a significant change. Many unions, especially what we refer to as the fossil fuel unions, the like the miners union and the construction unions, a few others, were dead set opposed to even talking about just transition, except to abuse it. The Rich Trumka, who was the president of the miners and then became president of the AFL-CIO, said a just transition is just another name for a fancy funeral. And that was a very widespread attitude, way beyond the fossil fuel unions themselves. Some unions, this was not a universal view. There were some unions that spoke positively of a just transition, but not very many. That has changed very much at a rhetorical level, so that the term just transition is now actually used by all kinds of top union leaders. And that represents a very big change at the talking the talk level. The question of what it'll mean at the walking the walk level, I think, is at the present an open question. The UAW not only speaking in favor of just transition, but specifically campaigning and striking for a program of just transition, I think represents a huge breakthrough. And we're going to have to see what the effect of that is throughout the rest of the labor movement. I've been advocating that other unions take it as an example and say, okay, that's what a just transition means in the auto industry. What does it mean in our industry? If you actually looked at what a just transition would mean for the construction industry, the opportunity for it to be both tremendously beneficial to workers and tremendously beneficial actually to the unions themselves, just in terms of membership and clout, it would be a very powerful thing to lay out what a just transition for the construction industry would mean, in the same way that the UAW has done it for the auto industry. In Canada, there was a study exactly along those lines that showed that in Canada, which is of course a lot smaller population than here, millions and millions of jobs would be created for construction workers alone through that transition from a fossil fuel economy to a climate safe, renewable economy. There is now an organization of teachers called the ECAN. It's the Educators Climate Action Network. And they are developing plans along these lines for what a green transition for education would be like, both in terms of the content of education and also in terms of what do schools look like, what do training programs look like. I think that can be done in practically every union and every industry. And that would be a way to move into a very different kind of labor politics around climate. And you can certainly see the beginnings of it. And the UAW has opened the door to, hey, why don't we all go through that door?
Yeah. I have to say, as a longtime climate organizer, it's exciting to see some of this shifts that we've just recently begun to see, both with the upsurge in labor organizing and action, and then also the increasing connections between labor and climate defenders, whatever you want to call us. Folks, we've been talking with Jeremy Brecher, who is the author of the great book Strike, also the great book Against Doom, a climate insurgency guide, Jeremy's a senior advisor to the Labor Network Sustainability, but is a writer and a historian and a documentary filmmaker and an activist, talking today with us about labor and talking to us about labor and climate. Jeremy, it's been a great conversation today. Really appreciate having you on. We're going to have you on again sometime soon. Oh, and one other thing about Jeremy is Jeremy has a great Substack called Strike, and definitely want to encourage everyone to subscribe to it because I've actually done a lot of reading on it recently. And so it's a great Substack and lots of great writings you have on there.
Yeah, thanks for coming on too. I read your book some years ago when I was in graduate school, and I've been familiar with it, and I've always admired what you've done. And to keep at it all these years is not the easiest thing because you lose a few.
Thanks very much. It's great to talk with you, and great to be able to have at least a one-way conversation with your audience.
Hey, folks, that was Jeremy Brecher, author and historian, activist, climate activist. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on the audio platforms, please give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And then if you really like us, check us and want to give us some money, and we'll take jingles and folds. I can't get that line right. Bob's much better at delivering that line. But go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And then we also have a special announcement. And if you're watching this on video, you can see that Bob is wearing a green and red hat. And we have many of those in stock now. And we'll be sending them out to anyone who sends us $25 to send us an email at greenredpodcast@gmail.com. And we also have a whole bunch of 2024 certain days calendars for political prisoners, which we will also send you for a $25 donation. Same email, and we'll send it all out. Just give us a little love.
It's Bob? 25 each for the calendar or the hat. They're separate, not 25 for both.
Yeah, it's not 20.
We got to be a little bit capitalist here.
Yeah, and the donation does include shipping. So just to put that out there too.
And we'll bless the hats for you too, since I am an ordained minister. I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah, that's true. Bob will bless the hats. I'm more of a pagan, so I have not become an ordained minister, although it's very easy from what I understand on the internet.
Hey, don't mock my calling.
Folks, we'll talk to y'all again soon. Misbehave, make trouble.
Memories are forever, said the dog on the tombstone. If you're living underneath the bridge, man, all roads lead to home. I got a hidden flask, I'm paid in cash, got a cross above my bed. You know, I hitchhiked from Chicago, and a man walked up and said, "This is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line. And if you come to strip our rights away, we'll give you hell every time. This is a union town, all down the line. Today the policeman's a union man, brother firefighter's my friend. And the kids locked in the Capitol are fighting till the end. And we're not gonna break tonight, and we're not gonna bend. Some say the union's down, but I asked around, and everybody said, this is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line. And if they come to strip our rights away, we'll give them hell every time. This is a union town, all down the line. A reaction, equal and opposite. That's why, my friend, the blood tastes good every time I'm here. I got a will to win and a Cheshire grin. Yeah, the night watchman is near, and you can't get it where you're at. but you can sure get it here. So come rain or sleet or dark or night, come wind or frigid snow, there's 100,000 in the streets, and that number's gonna grow. And when we put the governor on trial, I'll be in the front row. Just take a look around, we're a union town. 1, 2, 3, 4, let's go. This is a union town, a union town. All down the line, this is a union town, a union town. All down the line. And if they come to strip our rights away, we'll give them hell every time. This is a union town, a union town.